Welcome to the Mega Blast Podcast. I'm your host, Jason McDonald. My goal is to get to the truth through conversation. The Mega Blast Podcast is produced by Arts and Opinion, an online journal housed at the Archives of Canada. Visit us at artsandopinion.com. I hope you enjoy today's guest.
Welcome to the Likeville Podcast. This is John Faithfulheimer. Today I'm going to be talking with my friend Jason McDonald about Thomas Sowell, a very controversial intellectual economist. Welcome, Jason.
Hi, John. How you doing?
Hi, I'm doing very well. So maybe you can sort of just, for our listeners who aren't familiar with Thomas Sowell, maybe you can sort of just tell us a little bit about Thomas Sowell.
Yeah, sure. Well, he was born in the Carolinas a long time ago. He's very old, and his parents were extremely poor. His father died before he was born, I believe, and he had to be adopted by some relatives in New York, where he grew up in Harlem. And he went to good schools there. He was fortunate. He often says the schooling he got in New York in the I guess the 30s and 40s was better than a lot of the American schools are doing now. I don't know if that's true or not, but he says that. And he had a kind of a roundabout upbringing. He quit school, and then he joined the army, and he worked and did a bunch of things, and he ended up going back to university, I believe. He got into Harvard, and then he moved on from there, and he ended up at the University of Chicago, which anyone who knows anything about that school will know. It's a let's call it a libertarian or classical liberal orientation in its economic school, Milton and Friedman. So that was a life-changing experience for him. That oriented him. He was a Marxist at that point, which might surprise a lot of people, I think, although maybe not so many. A lot of these right-wing people, I think they started out as Marxists. That's a pretty common thing. Anyway, and then he went on and he got, I believe, graduate work in economics, and he wrote lots of books on economics, and he's written about other things, and he's dabbled in all kinds of different fields, variety of different things. So I don't know if that.
Yeah, no, that's a good. I mean, just to respond to one thing you said there, about the education system in the 1930s and 40s, that's actually very well documented. That it was better in many respects. There's actually a really good overview of this. The best one I've seen is in Malcolm Gladwell's book Outliers. He talks about how how much demographic troughs and like hills and valleys, how much those affect your future success in life. So he says, for instance, the best time to be in the public school system, especially in a place like New York, was in the 1930s, because you had just this perfect storm of awesome. So you had lots of highly intelligent women, especially, but not just women, minorities, various other people who were kept out of a lot of professions, which of course sucked for them in many ways because it limited their possibilities. But it was great for students because it meant that you had all of these, these Jewish women, Black women, all sorts who basically couldn't go into medicine, the law, and many other fields, but they could get into education. And so you had it's sort of similar to what we had here in Montreal with Concordia when it was Sir George Williams. So because McGill had Jewish quotas and had limitations on certain people getting into programs and into the university itself, you had all sorts of super brilliant, especially Jews, went to Sir George Williams because they couldn't get in anywhere else. And then you had professors at Sir George Williams, a whole bunch of them who were people who had been blacklisted during the Red Scare and during the the second Red Scare. And so they had to leave the United States because they were basically, victims of what we now call cancel culture. And they came up here, and a whole bunch of them. So you had at public schools, throughout North America, and at universities, you had people teaching at these places and people going to them who were what we would now see as being incredibly overqualified. You'd have you look at some of the teachers that were teaching public school in New York City in the 1930s. These are women with PhDs in, from top universities, but they couldn't get a job anywhere in higher education. And so and then combined with that, you had what's a demographic trough. So the birth rate went dramatically down during the Great Depression. So if you were one of the kids that went into public schools during that period, you got incredibly overqualified teachers who were amazing, who those teachers largely don't exist now in public education because they can go elsewhere and make much more money and have better status, right? And then so you had incredibly great teachers, and you had really small class sizes. So the class sizes at a public school in New York City, because those were all unionized workers, it's not as if you could just get rid of half of them when populations go down. So you still had these amazing, super great teachers, and you had class sizes that were a third to a half what they normally look like, which means little Thomas Sowell and other people like him got massive amounts of one-on-one attention from teachers in a way that kids in the 1920s or kids in the 1950s with the baby boom did not, right? So this, and Malcolm Gladwell says, it's no accident that we just get this amazing flowering of intellectual talent from Thomas Sowell's generation. Right?
Does he mention Sowell specifically, or is it just a general? I'm wondering who some of these other luminaries are. I'm sure.
Oh, he goes through. If you go in
I've read that book. I just don't remember that part.
You remember the chapter where he talks about, and it's been years since I've read the book, but you know the chapter where he talks about that Jewish lawyer who would take all the cases that nobody else would do. It's in that chapter. Yeah. It's in that chapter where he says how he was part of this generation of young people who came of age in New York City, going to the public schools at a point where it was just an amazing time to be going to a public school, right? And so many of those things are just not are just not present anymore. Like now, when I've taught at university classes, as a general rule, the education students are the absolute worst students in the class, right? So you're getting if in a class of 120 students, if there's 15 students that fail, the typical thing is 12 of them are from the education department.
Boy.
And which is so depressing as a parent when you're like, oh my God, this is who's going to be teaching our young people. But in the past, that was not the case. And actually, Alan Bloom talks about this in The Closing of the American Mind quite a bit, that obviously shutting people like Jews and women and stuff like that, shutting people out of higher education and various professions, that was unjust and it was wrong, and I'm glad that we fixed it. However,
it was also costly. Yeah, it was expensive.
It's just this weird situation where sometimes people benefit from injustice.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah,
it's ugly. It's ugly, but
you could look at that in multiple ways. I mean, it's possible that also cost us some amazing inventions too. Like we don't, those people who went. I mean, we don't know what didn't happen. We can't, right? So maybe some of those teachers who were teaching little Thomas Sowell and helping him become a great person, maybe they could have, invented something. It's very difficult to know, right?
Oh, I think that's almost definitely true. I mean, this was W.E.B. Du Bois his whole idea of I love his idea of the talented tenth, where he has that where he said that every time you exclude groups from opportunities, from education, from going into he said, for argument's sake, we should assume that within every group there is like what he calls the talented tenth, right? And if you basically close yourself off to entire like groups and say like, okay, they're not allowed to this, then you are excluding that talented tenth, and you're reducing the amount of talent that your community could draw upon for new ideas in business and military stuff and science and you name it, arts. Like you're closing off those possibilities by excluding those people. So yeah, no, definitely.
There's another famous case, I'm sure you've heard of him, of a guy who was rejected by McGill. Forget his name now, but he went to Queens in Ontario and he became this famous scientist, and he donated all of his art. He became this big art collector. I'm blanking on his name right now, but he did it like he openly said, like, McGill rejected me, right? And anyway, it's a side note that kind of a sad comment on what you're talking about there.
Yeah, it's odd. I mean, I find Thomas Sowell, I mean, he's an incredibly controversial figure for all sorts of reasons. I mean, I think part of he's annoying to a lot of people on the left, big time, because I think partially it's just because he's an African American guy who
can I just say something quickly about that?
Yeah, shoot.
There's sort of a story of how I got to know his work. After the 2008 financial crisis, I wasn't affected by it. I had a job at that point where I work. I'm a professor and teacher. And anyway, but I was fascinated, this thing had happened and I was like, what happened? So I started going down these rabbit holes on the internet and I stumbled upon this guy called Russ Roberts, who you may know about. He's an economist. He's Israel now. Yeah, he's really amazing interviewer. I sort of try and model myself to try and be like Russ Roberts. He's kind of like the opposite of me. He's very calm and relaxed and really, he's really good at disagreeing with people. And that's like a problem I have. So I've been listening to him for, 12 years or whatever. And on one of his shows, he had Thomas Sowell. And this was like maybe 5-6 years ago when Sowell wasn't as well known. He seems to be getting better known now. It appears to me, that could be an illusion, just my selective bias of who I'm with. But anyway, so I listened to the interview. I was like, wow, this guy sounds really smart. So I got one of his books and I read it and I was just completely sucked right into it. I couldn't put it down. And then I got another one. And then I was partway through the second or third book and he was talking about all these like African-American schools and all this stuff about the education. And I was like, well, wow, maybe this guy's black, right? I mean, it occurred to me, right? And then I went and looked at him. I was like, yeah, the guy is black, because I'd heard him on an audio thing. And I thought in some senses, it sounds kind of chintzy to say. I think some people might find that, I don't know. Like I told it to a friend of mine and she was sort of like, well, that's kind of, weird. But I think it's an amazing statement of just the amazing rigor of his work, that it doesn't, imagine reading, I don't know, just pick your great other intellectual right now, Ibram X. Kendi or, something like that. How could you read them without not knowing that, right? It's kind of, and with Sowell, it's kind of this incidental fact. His work stands on its own and his being black is just something on the side. So I don't really understand why people are so put off by that. Is it just perhaps, maybe he's on the right wing or something? I don't,
Well, I think people like him always are, at least initially, seem like a challenge to various kinds of essentialism. So if you say that like the importance of the identity of the person speaking it decides very much like whether or not you should listen to this or not. And if you believe in the whole idea of like epistemic privilege, that certain people, by virtue of their experience, have access to knowledge that other people do not. If you buy into all of that that idea.
A holy sainted, race or something, right? Something like that.
Well, it could be. It's mainly, I mean, he talks about the vision of the anointed. That's a different thing. But if you believe that that certain people, that 2 + 2 is not equal to 4 if certain people say it. And if some people say that 2 + 2 is equal to 5 and they're the right people, then, well, we have to revise things. It's 5 now because these people who are authoritative sources have said that it's this, and you need to, hashtag believe women, hashtag, shut up and listen, hashtag like if you buy into that whole situation, then that worldview, then people like Thomas Sowell are a problem. In the same way that Margaret Thatcher was a problem for some feminists when I was a kid. I remember asking a teacher once, like, who talked about how the world would be a better place if it was ruled by women. And I said, well, what about Margaret Thatcher? She's like starting wars and she seems to be pretty, and she said, oh, she's not a real woman.
Yeah.
And so you can say, well, Thomas Sowell is not a real Black man, or you can say, like, you can basically say anybody who doesn't fit into your categorization of what a Jewish person is supposed to believe. Like, oh, you don't totally support Israel, so you're a self-hating Jew, or you don't support my political program as a African American man. Well, you're an Uncle Tom, or you're there's always there's ways oh, you have internalized misogyny, and that's why you are not into feminism.
Don't you think it's kind of racist to do this? Like the Black example, that seems racist to me. That seems like you're taking his race and you're using it against him, right? Maybe I'm misunderstanding what racism is or something, but it just is.
I don't know. I mean, the funniest example of this I've seen, by far is, I don't know if you remember Douglas Murray in his book, The Madness of Crowds. He tells this. He has this hilarious. I actually wrote it down because I was like, I gotta mention this to Jason when we were talking. But he says, the London School of Economics is, as it boasts of itself, one of the world's leading universities of the social sciences. With an international intake and a global reach, LSE has always put engagement with the wider world at the heart of its mission. Over at its LSE Review of Books page in May 2012, a review appeared of a new book by Thomas Sowell, Intellectuals and Society, had come out 2 years earlier. But in the world of academia, intellectual drive-by shootings often happen at a more leisurely pace than the rest of society. The reviewer, Aidan Byrne, was the senior lecturer in English and Media and Cultural Studies at Wolverhampton University. In this capacity, his byline informed us, he specializes in masculinity in blah, 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 it goes on. For his part, Byrne was unimpressed by the highly partisan nature of Sowell's book. And so 2 years after Sowell's book had been published, Byrne took aim and attempted to fire. From his opening line, he warned that Intellectuals in Society consists of a series of outdated and sometimes dishonest shots at Sowell's political enemies. Among other charges included in Byrne's review was a claim that one line in Sowell's book echoed the concerns of the Tea Party and constituted a thinly disguised attack on racial integration. An even odder allegation against Sowell came when Byrne warned readers that Sowell's references to racial issues constituted little more than disordered and disturbing dog whistles. In a similar fashion, Sowell's arguments about the legacies of the past were also a coded intervention. Warming to his theme, Byrne explained to him, Sowell, slavery's cultural legacy means that it shouldn't be considered a moral problem, nor should amelioration be attempted. He goes on, and then the money shot is, he says, well, it's easy for a rich man, white man like Sowell to say these things. And it was just, I mean, I remember when that review, people were sharing it like crazy on like Facebook and Twitter, and they just looked so ridiculous, right? Like that and then they were incredibly embarrassed. They were
Could we say,
incredibly embarrassed, right,
could
when
we
they
say that
found
that's
out.
like white splaining? I don't know. Is that something
I
like, I
I
don't know.
guess. I mean, but it points out, and you and I have both seen this on Facebook like numerous times, where there'll be a debate happening about something, and somebody will say, "Well, it's interesting to note how the lack of diversity on this Facebook thread." And then, somebody will chime up. This happens like so often. They'll either chime up and say, actually, I'm South Asian, or I'm East Asian, or I'm, African Canadian, or I'm from the Caribbean, or I'm from South America, or I'm Mohawk, actually. And people will chime in and say, like, no, that's actually not true. And then you see exactly the same thing where they say, well, clearly you're not a real.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's
I mean,
the instance, right?
I mean, it sort of seems like there's two ways you can view the issue of race, right? You can view it in that determinative way, or you can take the Martin Luther King way, which is to say that, don't judge a person by the race. In other words, the race should not be something that's that important, right? So I think that Sowell, that's clearly what he's, his being black is just like, it's like me being white. It's not, I don't know. It's not something that's important. Like, there are so many other things about me that would rate higher than my ethnic racial background, in terms of how I view myself, right? Anglophone Montreal or Canadian Quebec or whatever, I could just go down on a whole list of things that, but anyway.
I mean, he is, I've learned a lot from Sowell, but I can't help but wonder, there are certain people who gain prominence in circles, and they gain prominence for reasons that are, have more to do than just like their thought. And I in the same way that you'll see like these, they have these horrible conferences, usually in Iran, where they're like conferences for Holocaust deniers, right? And they'll get together from all over the world, and you'll always
bring
see
in
like
some Israeli or something.
Exactly,
right?
they'll always bring in some like some Orthodox Jews, and they'll make sure to have them like up on the stage in the photo ops. Like, they want them, and the Soviet Union did the same thing with people like W.E.B. Du Bois, and where they would find like some people who it's just such a trope. Like, you see it once you start to see this pattern, it can become a little bit, and by a little bit I mean a lot, really tedious, where they'll, a very common trope in any, if you're looking at like Jezebel or any kind of like news outlet or organization that has an axe to grind, they'll have what I call this sort of the Saul to Paul stories, testimonials from people that basically sound like a non-musical version of the hymn Amazing Grace. It's like, I once was blind, but now I see. So if you go to right-wing sources, you'll find people saying, oh, I was once a Marxist and progressive, but I saw the light. And then on the other side, you'll see people, if you want to read, Democracy Now! And they'll have people saying, I was once a free market libertarian, but I saw the light, and then like everybody has these narratives.
Right.
And I wonder, I can't help but suspect that Thomas Sowell's success is to some extent a function of the fact that he was a convenient spokesman for a bunch of ideas. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I totally understand. I mean, that so there's probably, you could divide, there are millions of people who are reading his work, right? And so, there must be a subset who are secret racists, is what the charge would be, right? So there's a subset of people who they're reading his work and they don't really respect him as a person as much as they would if it was or to another person who they might love, right? They don't have any black friends, or they're like true racists or something, but they're using him as a, how much of his popularity is due to that? I don't know. Does it matter that much? I mean, does that affect the quality of his work? Do you think that he's affected by that and he's responded because he's gotten more popular? Yeah, and that's affected his work negatively. Like, I don't think that is necessarily true. Although it could be. I mean, I'm not him. I don't think that.
Yeah.
I think he has a kind of a rigor and intellectual honesty. He is a right-wing person. Him. I actually don't agree with him on some of his right-wing things. He's kind of, some of this sort of abortion. It sounds like I'm pro-choice, for example, right? And he seems to be more on the other side. But okay, is that because he is trying to please the Tea Party people who are a bunch of old white guys or something? Or is that just really what he believes, right?
Oh, no, I wouldn't. I don't. I seriously doubt that. I would never accuse him of like sort of tailoring his views to, singing for whatever piper is playing the song. I don't think he's doing anything like that.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that people often. I had a friend of mine who's actually been on the podcast before, and he's kind of been a little bit disillusioned with libertarianism in the last couple of years, but he was hardcore. Like, he went to the libertarian camps in California. He went to the objectivist, like Ayn Rand groups. Like, he was practically like cult member level, like, commitment to this stuff. Like, he actually went to training camps, like red diaper baby camps, except for libertarians and Randians and stuff like that. And he said, it was interesting because he'd go to these things and like, it was just every single libertarian conference he went to was overwhelmingly, and by overwhelmingly, like, we're talking, he said minimum 80%, sometimes as much as 95%, was basically like white guys.
Right.
Like,
white and male, like also male.
White and male.
And male.
Yeah. White and male. And he said, and they, it was very clearly was kind of an ideology that appealed primarily to that demographic, but you would always have like a sprinkling of some like Asians, some Blacks, some like Latinos, some women. And he said, but what was amazing is that, like, on the panel for the photo ops and stuff like that, they would always, as much as possible, and he,
put the black guy up there.
knowing practically nobody at these things, because he was Asian, they would ask him to come up for all the photos. Just like, oh yeah, we want to like make it look like it's a much more diverse group than it actually is, right? So I wonder if, to what extent, somebody like Thomas Sowell like benefited from that.
He may have. I mean, does that matter? I mean, is that something like I'm just trying to figure out why that would be something that would be important. You know what I mean? Like, is it? Maybe is it distasteful? It sounds a little bit sort of sleazy to me. Especially if they're being used, right?
Yeah.
What are the implications for the wider impact of Sowell's work? I don't know. That's are there any? Maybe there are not. Does it matter? I don't know.
It doesn't matter to me very much, if at all. Actually, it doesn't really matter to me
at all. Actually.
Yeah, but
like that for me. But I mean, maybe for other people, there's some sort of a reason why we should be suspicious of him or something. I don't know. And there might be a reasonable reason for that too. Like I can't see. Maybe you could tell me what it is, right?
Yeah. Well, I guess it depends. Like, if there's, I would sort of say that there's definitely some overlap, but as a general rule, I would say that when it comes to, let's say, books, there's sort of two categories of books, right? There's one which where like your personal experience is extremely important to whether I should take this seriously or not. So if somebody writes a book, like an adventure book, like, for instance, our friend Mike, right? Like Mike Spencer Bone. Yeah, no, Mike Spencer Bone, who wrote The World's Most Traveled Man. It's a fantastic book. He's been on the podcast, and he's traveled to every country on Earth since 2000, and even like ones that are incredibly hard to get into. He's been to like war-torn countries, like while he was in Iraq during the war, backpacking around.
Wow.
So his book is absolutely fascinating because he's just telling you about all these wild, crazy experiences that he's had all over the world recently, since 2000.
Right.
Now, if I found out that it was all bullshit, it was all a hoax, that he actually has been living in Calgary in his mom's basement this whole time, and I know Mike's listening to this, so if I found out it was all bullshit and he just made it up, that would totally change my view, because his book is based on his experiences, his adventures. Right. But if somebody writes a book like Conflict of Visions, or the books that Thomas Sowell has written, they're books of ideas, and they stand or fall on their own merit. It doesn't really matter very much who he is. I don't feel like his identity, if I found out that Thomas Sowell was actually if I found out he was actually a Jewish woman who was dressing up like a black man because she has some sort of Rachel Dolezal smushed with I don't know, Jenner, whatever, Caitlyn Jenner, I don't know. If I found out that his identity was different than he presented to people, and this was only found out after his death, let's say, it wouldn't change my readings of his books very much.
Not many of them. I was going to say there are some parts. As I said, I stumbled upon, I think it was the Black Rednecks and White Liberals. That was the second or third book. And in that book, he talks a lot about education for African Americans and so on. And it turns out that is something that is at least connected to his own experience to some extent, right? Right. So I suppose you could take some of his work and sort of siphon it off to maybe 10% of it, let's say, and the rest of it would all just be ideas, or even less than 10%, really.
Yeah. Well, I think his most, where he, and I was saying this, talking to some friends the other day, where, first of all of his books, I think the one that they were trashing in that review that went viral, because it's, well, as a white man, as a privileged white man, that of all of his books, I think that's
the intellectual, what's it called?
Intellectuals in Society.
Yeah.
I find that to be by far his best book of all the ones that I've read, just because he covers a massive amount of ground, and he actually summarizes in a chapter stuff that he devotes entire books to elsewhere, and so he really distills it down into a very kind of understandable.
I'm curious,
well, particularly there's this one part that I thought our listeners absolutely should, is where his basic idea of the tragic vision versus the vision of the anointed. And I wanted to actually spend a lot of time on that, because I think that is
important.
It's so powerful.
Yeah, I know, it's really an important part of it.
So just he says that that there's two underlying, what we call progressivism and conservatism. There are two very, very, very different visions of the world and of human nature and of civilization, and that if you don't see that, then you're not going to be able to make sense of. There's going to be just this huge chasm of misunderstanding between. And so for he says, at the heart of the social vision prevalent among contemporary intellectuals is the belief that there are problems created by institutions, and that solutions to these problems can be excogitated by intellectuals. The vision is both a vision of society and a vision of the role of intellectuals within society. In short, intellectuals have seen themselves not simply as an elite in the passive sense in which large landowners, rentiers, or holders of various sinecures might qualify as elites, but as an anointed elite, people with a mission to lead others in one way or another toward better lives. And it goes on and he says, the vision of society in which there are many problems to be solved by applying the ideas of morally anointed intellectual elites is by no means the only vision, however much that vision may be prevalent among today's intellectuals. A conflicting vision has coexisted for centuries, a vision in which the inherent flaws of human beings are the fundamental problem, and social contrivances are simply imperfect means of trying to cope with those flaws, the imperfections of these contrivances being themselves products of the inherent shortcomings of human beings. That is the blah, blah, blah. So the idea being that in the tragic vision, barbarism.
Just something quickly, just the names of those. He originally named those the unconstrained vision. The first one you named out, unconstrained. And the second one, the constrained. And I think Steven Pinker renamed them utopian versus tragic visions, which I think is better. I think Steven Pinker's naming is better in the sense it makes you remember them more easily, right? Like, so people who, a left-wing view, let's say, just to put it on the political spectrum, would think that if we have these amazing ideas and we put them into practice, usually through government, then we're going to have things that are going to be better in the future, and we're going to move towards some sort of a utopia by our actions, right? The opposite view is a tragic view that we're just these miserable, horrible people, all of us, we're all sinners, something like that, if put in a religious sense. And all we have to kind of have institutional structures that, incentivize us not to be selfish and barbaric and to be, to go towards the better angels of our nature, right?
Yeah.
He even talks about how people with these two different views, it's almost like they're living on different planets, right? Like in the sense that they're thinking about people in such different ways that it's almost like they're thinking about different people. At one point he says that, which I think is really interesting. But anyway, I apologize.
Yeah, no, it is actually very, very, and I like, I like what he says. This is from another one of his books where he says, the opposing visions differ not only in what they believe exists and in what they think is possible, but also in what they think needs explaining. To those with the vision of the anointed, it is such evils as poverty, crime, war, and injustice which require explanation. To those with the tragic vision, however, it is prosperity, law, peace, and such justice as we have achieved, which require not only explanation, but constant efforts, trade-offs, and sacrifices just to maintain them at their existing levels, much less promote their enhancement over time. That is just absolutely very fantastic. Yeah. It's very, very powerful. Yeah. And I think it's quite true. I mean, I've seen, I've traveled around enough I've been in places where you have an incredibly weak state, where you have, you basically don't have law and order, where violence is an ever-present threat. And you have to be very, very careful, because all sorts of bad things can happen to you easily, right? If you've grown up in an environment like that, or you've been exposed to it, then I think the tragic vision makes more sense, because you realize that actually, like, not having any kind of like institution. Not having law and order, not having institutions, it doesn't shake out on its own. It doesn't just it doesn't just go towards calm and peace on its own naturally. Yeah, exactly. And that's one thing I found with a lot of kind of progressives who have an anarchist bent, and also with some libertarians who have an anarchist bent, is that they're so unbelievably naive and what Thomas Sowell talks about, that like they think that somehow if you just eliminated, law enforcement and eliminated the state, that there would be this wonderful spontaneous order would just emerge and it would be amazing and everything would be great. And like Thomas Sowell's point is like, what are you fucking talking about? Like, no, it won't.
Well, Steven Pinker's, I don't know if you've read his book, The Better Angels. I mean,
sure, of course. I've taught all of the elements.
all of the evidence in Thomas Sowell's work as well is the opposite, that humans lived in a state of anarchy for most of our time on this planet, where we spent most of our time trying to, make sure that this other group didn't attack us and maybe attack them first. And that took up a lot of our, human capital, right? For us, and when you have a Leviathan, when you have some sort of institutional structure, I was just reading one of Sowell's books about empires, conquest and empires today. I was finishing up the part on the United Kingdom. And he talked about how in England, they gradually moved towards a system where the Leviathan was able to, basically become a normality there earlier than in other parts of Europe and the world. And that opens up then things like long-term investments. People can say, okay, I want to spend, this amount of money to make that amount of money in 20 years or something. I know that the state's not going to repossess my stuff, or that this, someone's not going to come and steal it, or some other sort of a thing. And you get a kind of movement towards a better life, let's say, right, in that context. But yeah.
Well, I guess one of my I find this is like definitely when he describes this conflict divisions and when he describes like what these positions entail, this is for me like him at his absolute best. Like I find him very wise and very useful and very interesting when he's talking about these things. Where I find his thought falls apart and becomes much, much more flimsy is when he tries to sort of connect the tragic vision to a sort of laissez-faire free market. It can be, because it seems to me that if you adopt the tragic vision, and I'm very partial to the tragic vision, but if you adopt the tragic vision, it seems to push primarily in the opposite direction, that you can't. And he never, in everything I've written, I've read by him, he never adequately explains how he reconciles this tragic vision with free markets. Because he says that there's going to be this spontaneous order that's going to emerge, and that if you just get out of the way, everything, when in fact his whole argument pushes in the other direction.
Yeah, I don't see that the same way, I think, because there's something in economics called emergent order, which he's referring to, right? Which is to say that, one example I think Sowell gives, and a lot of people give as an example of emergent order, is language. There's nobody designed the language we speak, right? It sort of shakes out over time, and words, we start using certain words and they become common, or they don't, just depending on social, convention. And part of the tragic vision too is an allowance for something like wisdom and accrued knowledge being put. He talks a lot about this. I'm sure you've noticed this, right?
Sure.
Ahead of, because the anointed, if you think about the anointed, it's a focus on, abstract thinking and IQ, right? So it's sort of like, you can take all these ideas and put them together and they're beautiful there. And then, whether or not they apply over time, whether or not it's going to work over a period of time is not known, and they might or they might not. But if you look at an institutional structure that functions over a very long period of time, it seems to work, right? There's a lot of accrued knowledge in there, like in a country, let's say, right? So I don't see a contradiction there. I don't, those things can, emergent order is something that can exist in biology, it exists in economics, it exists in all sorts of things. And I don't see.
Oh, it's a basic property of the universe as we know it. It's physics, biology, everything. Yeah. No, I totally.
How is that in conflict with the tragic vision? They seem like different things. Maybe I'm not following your logic. I don't know. But
well, because to take an analogy to horticulture, to gardening. So my buddy Alex is planning out all of his gardens for this summer, and he's got an expanded. And so what you do with gardening is you obviously kind of set up a situation. You build fences to keep out like groundhogs, and you have other things to try and to protect your plants from from pests and from fungi and from birds and various things like that. And so then you try and make sure you've got the right soil, right fertilizer, and all those things. And so you set it all up, and then you put in a bunch of different plants. But then there's this randomness, and there's stuff that's outside of your control, which is like the amount of sun that happens that summer, how cold it gets, how hot it gets, if there's enough rain or too much or too little, or there's all these other factors which are not out of your control. And so if you try and obsessive compulsively manage a garden, it won't work. But you basically you do a bunch of stuff, and then you kind of just like see what comes up, and you see what does well, and then you, even if you don't understand why this plant that you really wanted to grow just doesn't seem to fucking like living here. It just doesn't. It looks like shit all the time. It doesn't. It's really fragile.
Happy.
You basically have to. Yeah, you basically have to go with like what seems to, out of this emergent order, what is like working well and what isn't. Right. So I see an economy as being similar to that. There's a bunch of factors that no amount of central planning is ever going to be able to think of everything, right? So what you do is you create an economy that is governed by laws and by there's certain things that you can and cannot do that are against the law. And so you create this good environment with restrictions and stuff like that, and then you sort of just like sit back and see what comes up and see what works and what doesn't, right? And you can't. It seems to me like the far end of the laissez-faire spectrum seems to want to say that we should just get rid of all of those restrictions, and that's going to sort of unpack or unleash the true power of our garden. When in fact, if you take down the fences around your garden, if you stop like monitoring the water, and like, so you say, well, I just want to, survival of the fittest. Like, so let's say it gets really hot and dry for 2 weeks in July, and now a smart gardener would notice this and water the garden once a day. But somebody who says, yeah, I just want it to be survival of the fittest, just like, hey, too big to fail. Blah, blah. Like, okay, well, I'm just gonna let my whole fucking garden be. You're an idiot. Like, you're gonna not water it. Like, and so
too big to fail is actually intervening. In fact, right? It's, you know what I mean. Like
but I think in the same way that intelligent, if you over garden a garden, it's not going to work.
But if you underprotect it, it will somehow be.
Yeah, and I think it seems it's obvious to me. And Jonathan Haidt is working. His new book is on the morality of capitalism, and he's talking about how people. He's very influenced by Thomas Sowell, and he was telling me that he's writing on this, and he says, people imagine, especially in academics and intellectuals and people on the left, that capitalism is just this immoral system. And he says, actually, it's intensely moral, and it's so dependent on morality and ethics that if you try and make capitalism work in a place that doesn't have the proper sort of culture and morality and ethics in place, that capitalism will not take root there. It won't work. That you need to people have to be quite trustworthy and honest, and you have to have high amounts of social trust and law and order for capitalism to work, right? So his point is that the idea that just getting rid of all government regulations and that this naturally is going to unleash the power of the economy. So this is just completely a wrong way to think about it. Like it's about the right kinds of fences and the right kinds of interventions that help the garden flourish, to its greatest extent. But there is this among certain certain people, there's this idea that somehow, there's one way to fix all of these problems, and it's just deregulation. And there's one problem, and it's always government, and it becomes so circular that you can basically explain absolutely. It's like trying to talk to a fundamentalist Christian. Like, they can explain everything with regard to demonic intervention in the world. Like, and it doesn't matter. Like, you can bring up any objection. They're like, well, clearly that's just demonic. And so they'll say like, oh, well, that's government regulation. That's what caused that. That's what it's like. If it explains everything, it explains nothing.
Yeah.
So
I just, what I would interject there quickly is that you mentioned that some places have functioning economies. Take Denmark or some place that has, or the United States, or some relatively functional place, and you've got a higher level of trust than you have in I don't know, Angola or Russia or some country where there's less. And that's true, except that it's not necessarily. I mean, it's embedded into the culture through the institutions in a country that functions well. People build up that trust over time when the institutions are like just the walls around the garden, pretty much, right? It's like you set up this system, and the walls around the garden, to me, when you talk about that, what I see is a good system of defense, because that's what the government should be doing, right? Making sure the country is safe from external attack. Inside the garden, when you're doing some of the micromanaging, you're pulling the insects get in there, you try and get them out of there. That's like internal security, right? That's kind of like maybe policing. If people can't feel safe, right, they're not likely to go out of their houses and do things, in order to make their lives better and other people's lives better, right? They're going to stay home, and that's going to be bad for them. And, we're seeing that right now, obviously. But to say I don't think it's in the culture necessarily. I think that culture develops over time, and it can develop. I believe, maybe I'm optimistic, but I think that type of culture can exist anywhere. I don't think there's anything unique about Danes as people. Like, I don't think that they're, superior in any way to, Russians or Angolans or something like that. It's just that over time that has risen, the trust has risen over time, and they've got this, for the most part, in a functional society, you've got kind of a good balance between those things. Now, just to get to your point about, the growth, I think the deregulation point is that, any institution will seek to, expand and get more powerful. Any institution, any individual, that's a natural tendency. So a business will try and grow, right? Governments will do the same thing, right? They will, right? They will, if they can, they will expand. So you see this cycle where there's increasing intervention in the economy, usually for some sort of an emergency. So you had the 1930s, had this, this terrible depression, and then there was a war. Both of those things needed government intervention, especially the war. I think there's a better case for that, right? That needs more of government state intervention. Then a lot of those things remained in place, right? I don't know if you've read Basic Economics, but
yes, yeah.
But those things stayed in place. So by the 1970s, you got this sort of choking, seizing structure in place, right? That's where the idea of laissez-faire. I don't think laissez-faire means just take everything away. I think it means, all else being equal, it's better to let people transact as they wish than to intervene in most, and unless you can prove otherwise, unless you can prove that there's going to be some sort of imminent threat as a result of that openness, right? And so 90% of the time, it's, so if we just take some local examples here in Canada, just to take deregulation, right? So you have the airline industry in Canada is sort of partly deregulated. You've got two major airlines, some smaller ones, but it's also protected from foreign competition, right? So that means that if I'm going to fly from Montreal to Vancouver or something like that, right? I can only fly on a Canadian airline. We have the same thing with cellular telephone, provision, right? So I can't buy a ticket from American Airlines and fly from Montreal to Vancouver. I have to buy, right? So if we were to open that up, the prices would go down. Now you could say, well, no, but then we're just going to be taken over by all these American airlines and European airlines that come in. That's true, except that opening is almost always reciprocal, right? So if we were to open it up, they would open their markets. So Air Canada could fly from New York to Los Angeles and Chicago to Atlanta or whatever as well, right? And there's very little evidence that it would actually, most of the time when those types of things open up and liberalize, you see expansion and more well-being most of the time, right? Anyway, the concept of predatory pricing is another thing. If you want me to keep talking, Thomas Sowell talks a lot about how that actually is doesn't make a lot of sense. If you play it out to its conclusion, right? If you have, predatory pricing, just to expose what it means, right? So the idea is that Walmart is going to come into Canada and it's going to drop prices to below even what they can, charge to make money. And they're going to drive all the retailers out and they're going to become the main retailer. And then they're going to jack up the prices for all eternity, right? That's the theory. You really can't find an example where that's happened, right? The only cases where you see a predatory monopoly, I'm aware of, maybe you can tell me one, is when the government protects it, right? The SAQ, right? If you want to buy liquor in Quebec, right, you have to go to the SAQ. So they charge. And then to me, there's two effects of that. So the prices are higher, right? That's one negative effect. So, the other negative effect is that guy who owns the dépanneur, he can't enrich his life by offering liquor, right? So his life in some senses is made worse off as well, right? So we have fewer opportunities for people when we have these types of government monopolies, but we have more opportunities when we disperse them, but anyway.
Well, but the typical DEP, and I'm really fascinated with the economics of depth, actually. Or for our listeners who live in New York, this is a bodega or a corner store, or it's a kind of an all-purpose kind of store that you can get everything from tampons to milk to bread to beer, cigarettes. The typical DEP brings in 80 to 90% of their profit is from selling liquor, cigarettes, and lottery tickets.
Not liquor. They're not allowed to sell liquor.
Well, yeah,
beer and
booze,
wine.
booze,
alcohol,
cigarettes, and lottery tickets. So they are making money off of booze.
No, but not from liquor, though.
No,
they're not
but they're making lots of. They're actually, the typical DEP is way more profitable than an SAQ.
Well, that's because they're better run and better managed than the SAQ. That's probably. I mean, I don't know. That's an interesting thing, but the SAQ has a centralized bureaucracy. It has, these buyers. So you get this problem again with something like the SAQ, where you've got a centralized system of buying. So then that means that the big wine and liquor producers, they fly the buyers over to Paris and to the south of France and try and wine and dine them, because if they can convince that one guy, he's going to buy all this wine. Whereas when you have different distributors competing, right, who's going to buy the stuff, the prices will go down, right?
Yeah.
For consumers. Now, I mean, you can say, well, who cares if people pay more for beer? It's bad for their health and so on, But again, I still think it's a smaller thing. It's you're right. In Quebec, because the fact that beer is available in many parts of Canada, that's not the case, right?
But, well, there is the other issue that, talking about how, we need to remove all barriers to trade and things like this, and this is necessarily going to produce like the best results. That's clearly true with a number of things. In fact, I would maybe even say that's true with most things. But there's plenty of things where that's not true, and it usually kind of covers up. So if you look at why Finland, why Finland was good at cell phones, right? Or why the United States was the powerhouse in the 19th century when they were still kind of a small country. It was largely because they had a lot of protections on their own industries. And a lot, like you look all over the world at the economies that have done really well and that are doing really well, they often have all sorts of like controls. They shelter certain industries to help them. to help them grow and to give them advantages and things like that. And then after that, when they become really big, they go on the world stage and say, the way the United States has done at various points, like, okay, everybody just have like free trade and don't have any protectionism, don't protect any kind of industries when they're young. And you kind of look at American history and say, well, that's what you guys did. Like, that's, you guys did this. In fact, like most of the economies that are really kicking ass did precisely that. So it seems sort of disingenuous to say, like,
the United States had enormous foreign investment when it was a developing country in the 19th century, mostly from British capital. So it was fairly open to investment. That's a really key one, right? You have to allow capital. And again, you have to have a framework inside where if someone's going to come into your country and invest in, building a railroad or whatever it's going to be, they don't want a fear that it's going to be, just the legal structure is going to change tomorrow. Thing, right? It's like, oh my God, now, we invested $10 million and, now it's all different. Or even worse, what you see in some places is seizures, right? Nationalization of things, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I don't really agree necessarily, at least I don't see it the same way that the United States, I mean, there was more protectionism in the past, generally speaking, across the world. You've seen less protectionism over time, and that's always reciprocal, right? Those things tend to be things, two entities, in this case, we're talking about countries, will get together and agree to, and in some cases they can be multilateral. But the general axiom is still the same, that the more exchange you allow, generally speaking, it's going to be better for most people. Now, there are losers in this, right? We see, I mean, just to talk about the U.S. in modern times, that, this most recent period of open worldwide trade has created a very severe let's say, a cleavage between certain segments of American society. And this is playing out in other countries as well, probably in this country to a lesser extent. But, so you have some people who are more, they live on the coast of San Francisco and they're more familiar with a restaurant in Beijing and they've never been into Fresno or whatever. And there are people living in there that they would sort of look down upon, right? That's partly a result of this, very highly open trade of the world is perhaps a negative effect too. I don't know how to solve that problem simply by putting up trade barriers. That cultural problem has been created. I don't, I'm not sure how to deal with that, how to fit that into the economic structure. But there's no doubt that the openness of trade has led to more, the rising of living standards in most places, right? I mean,
I think the answer is, what Andrew Yang says. It's some sort of version of universal basic income, because once you have that, I think probably the most scathing indictment that I've read of the present way of doing things, it's funny, it didn't come from which I would have expected it to come from. It didn't come from like somebody who's a real sort of free market, libertarian, or it didn't come from somebody. It came from David Graeber, who just died recently, quite suddenly. And in his book, Bullshit Jobs, he has a whole chapter devoted to why we need a universal basic income. And he says, right now we have this policy all over the industrialized world, which came out of the Great Depression, which was saying that, okay, we need to have full employment because full employment is, really good. People will be making money, they'll have taxes. And as soon as people are unemployed, they become sort of the government's problem. And we want to have as few people in that side of in that category as possible, right? So this is why, he goes, we have this idea that corporate welfare is all a function of corruption, that, that you have these government officials that are in bed with the oil and gas industry or the car industry, and that's why they're giving them all these subsidies and all these breaks and things like that. And he says, actually, the truth is so much more depressing than that. He says, yes, sure. There's some times where it's straight up corruption, sure, but very often it's no money's changing hands. It's not corruption in the sense of like muhahaha. It's more that the Quebec government will give all sorts of money to Bombardier, or the American government will give all sorts of money to GM or to Ford or Chrysler because they don't want.
Yeah, but anyway.
They did Ford too. At one point,
Ford as well, right? Okay, I remember Ford.
They gave Ford lots of money too.
Okay.
But it's always on the reasoning that we don't want to lose all of those jobs, right? Because all those jobs,
they're voters. They're voters.
Yeah,
that's one reason, right?
But it ends up being probably, as David Graeber says, it's one of the most perverse forms of trickle-down economics that he said. I can't think of any, because you're literally paying. I
agree.
You're paying like twice a person's salary to keep them in the job. It's like if you would just give them the money directly, in some other way, that would actually be way cheaper.
I think Thomas Sowell would agree that that's complete. In fact, I've read pieces by him where he points out when you subsidize an industry in some way, you effectively paying these people way too much to do something that you would be better off if the industry were, let's say, the aeronautics industry in Quebec. Let's imagine this sort of worst case scenario that it just completely died because the government, but that would still be better in the longer run, because then, those people would maybe go do something more interesting that, like it's better for them or something like that, right?
Yeah. I guess one of the questions, I was looking at sort of people who grew up in the same milieu as Thomas Sowell, and one person that immediately came to mind as an interesting parallel was Daniel Bell, the great American intellectual. And he also had a similar trajectory where he started off as a Marxist, and then he gradually shifted. He became a hardcore, like, Cold Warrior, and he became, very kind of a Cold Warrior and very kind of conservative right-wing guy. But he did something that I've never seen. Maybe Thomas Sowell did this. I mean, he's incredibly prolific. Maybe he did this somewhere that I'm not aware of. But in everything I've read of Thomas Sowell, I've never seen him address that contradiction that I mentioned before between a commitment to the tragic vision and a commitment to free, just like a very kind of laissez-faire attitude towards economists. But Daniel Bell wrote a book which in conservative circles is considered an absolute classic. It's called The Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism in 1976. And he addressed this question head on, and he said that there is this problem, which is that capitalism tends to sort of encourage certain kinds of worldviews and certain kinds of ways of being in the world, which end up making you a bad capitalist. So it's like it seems very strange, but the people who often are best at capitalism are people who come from various minority groups, religious minority groups, or various who have have a real commitment to hard work and diligence, and who have within their group they have a great deal of kind of trust. And you see this in many groups all over the world that are very much involved in trade. You can look at Han Chinese all over Southeast Asia and Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore.
Middlemen minorities, I think they're called.
Yeah, they're sort of like, and then South Asians in East Africa and other places, and then Jews in a lot of places. There are these like minority groups that end up really kicking ass at trade and at, like, they kick ass at capitalism. But the reason why they kick ass is to some extent because of stuff that have nothing to do with capitalism. And if their kids just grow up and are completely assimilated into the mainstream consumer culture, chances are their kids are going to suck at being capitalists.
Well, there's evidence for that. Yeah, with the Chinese, I think third generation Chinese Americans are nowhere near as well off as their grandparents and the first few generations in the United States. That's just some proof. I think that's probably true, right?
Yeah. Well, this is. I think there was what was the book called? It was the full package. I think that was what it was called, and it's Amy Chua.
Amy Chua, yeah. That's what I'm referring to. I'm actually referencing her. Yeah.
And her husband, they wrote that book, The Full Package, which was, it looked at Han Chinese, Hindu South Asians, Mormons, and Jews in the United States. And these are three minority groups that punch way, way above their weight.
Economically, but not in other areas that we could talk about, right? Like, I mean, like you could just look at economics, but what about like if you included the greatest musical geniuses of the past 75 years, right? You wouldn't find too many Chinese Americans in that. You would find a lot of African Americans,
yeah,
right?
And tons of Jews as well.
Yeah, a lot of Jews too. Yeah, the Jews are an interesting. Depending, you mean the music producers? Like, I'm not sure.
Even musicians. That's been. I mean, they've been. But I mean, their point was that and this is kind of Daniel Bell's point, is that there is this, generally speaking, if you have a system, it tends to reproduce itself. That is the norm, right? So, and Daniel Bell's point is capitalism seems to be strange in the sense that it's a system that the more thoroughly people adopt it, it tends to extinguish itself. It tends to actually suck up all the oxygen in the room and then not be able to go on. So that's why capitalism is constantly, of necessity, is always looking for new markets and new places, emerging markets, and is always bringing in more and more people into the fold. And very often those people who are brought into the fold do very well at that system, but to the extent to which they do well, their kids probably will not be good at it, which is this weird contradiction. Daniel Bell was saying, there's you have to, who knows if there's a solution to this dilemma.
It also raises sort of some philosophical questions about what's important, right? So we're measuring importance and success on, basically on income and wealth, right? That's what we're doing right now, right? So we're saying a group of people who, they make a lot of money and they own a lot of stuff or whatever, they're doing really well. There are other things you could, like if you took a Sowellian analysis, you know how Thomas Sowell goes to like Malaysia and like digs through archives to try and find the differences between the Malays and the Chinese in that country. I don't know if you've read those studies that he did.
No, I haven't read that. That's really interesting.
He's gone into great detail about this, trying to explain, exactly what you're talking about, why certain groups do better and why other ones don't. But I find it fascinating to read about, because he talks about how the Malays, they dominate the political system in that country, and they, the other social institutions as well. But they're like totally absent in the businesses and the sciences and things like this. It's very interesting. It's very. And so again, it goes back to what you're saying. But if you take a look at like what's important, right? So you could look at our wonderful province, Quebec, right? You could see some similar patterns, right? A Jewish minority that has done exceptionally well. You could also see the creation, the creation of Quebec as a British entity with an Anglophone minority that was very important in business. You could break down the groups. Scottish Canadians being really big in business and engineering and stuff like this, and say, wow, that's interesting. Similar type of a analysis. Then you could say, well, what about the French Canadians, right? They seem to be lower economically throughout history, which is true. And in fact, Franco-Americans, if you look at people from Quebec, mostly from Quebec, who emigrated to the United States, even to this day, have lower income than other Americans. I don't know if you knew that, but that's also...
I did not know that, no.
So you wonder, what's that about? Then you look around, you say, what was important to people in Quebec, especially in small towns. Well, they had a community. They would always build an incredible church. You go around, it's something just amazes me. Not just in Montreal, but you go to any town in Quebec and you just see this spectacular stonemasonry, right?
Yeah.
What built that? That wasn't some sort of an economic, that was something where they valued that. They wanted to have a beautiful church. It was a status thing. And then, they got really good at stonemasonry. This is something you see. So you see some generation over generation, people working in stone and artistic things, and you see a lot of Francophones going into the law. There was sort of the clerical element of the society was, but years ago I worked I'm
so glad you pointed that out, because that's something that I've tried to explain to my American relatives and friends, and they always you really have to see it to understand how it's you go to this place, you go to this small town in Quebec.
There's 200 people there or something.
And you look at it's never had a population more than sort of 2,000, 3,000 people ever in its history. It's in this desolate wasteland. It doesn't have a lot of resources. It's not as if they're sitting next to some massive, diamond mine or most productive agricultural land in the world, or oil and gas reserves. Or it's in this place where it's winter for 6-7 months out of the year. It's cold. It doesn't have a lot of natural resources. And they've got this stunning Catholic church that is just to build something like that with the kind of artistry that went in, like you say, the stonemasonry, the woodwork, everything. It would just cost it would cost hundreds of millions of dollars to build a cathedral like that today. And these poor communities, they did it over. I mean, it's sort of, I was trying to explain it to one of my cousins, and I said, you go to a small town in Iowa or in New Hampshire, and you see the church, and it's this sober Protestant, all white church with a little cross at the front. It looks like it fits the town, right? But imagine if you went to some small town in the middle of Iowa, and they had a giant opera hall, a giant, beautiful, palatial opera hall. And they had a play, and you're how did they put up this huge, and then they had a massive museum, with all sorts of Monets and Picassos and stuff like that. How the fuck did they afford this shit? Yeah. It's it also, like you say, it's what they prioritized.
But it's also interesting because these things, Sowell talks extensively about these things, how pass intergenerationally, right? So it's so he studies, for example, German immigrants in Canada and the United States and Brazil, and he finds all these similarities between, and even their descendants, right? So years ago, I worked for this, for a multimedia company, and for about a couple of years, and I was a producer there. And the company grew very quickly. We made websites and things like that. So there were producers, and there were people who worked on the finance end, and there were graphic artists and programmers. And I started to notice as the company got really big that you could see differences in the kind of people who were graphic artists or the kind of people who were programmers. The graphic artists were almost entirely French Canadians, right? And yet there were almost nobody in the finance end who were very few, who were much fewer, not nobody, but a lot smaller percentage, let's say, And so you look at that and you think, well, why is that, right? Why would young Francophones growing up in the 1990s, be much more likely to go and study how to use Photoshop and try and get a job, right? As opposed to studying finance or something like that. And many also study finance. But you wonder if these things, they create different outcomes. Some of them may end up with, you might have people who end up on average poorer in some cases because of the choices they make, right? So if you look at Irish immigrants to the United States who tended to go into politics and becoming cops and stuff like that, they didn't do as well financially as, say the Jewish immigrants, right, who started business, did all this stuff, right? So does that mean, those differences between Jewish immigrants and Irish immigrants, the Irish, Thomas Sowell's books about these two groups are really fascinating. I don't know if you've read them, but the Irish being really big in unions and in the law. Like if you look at the political systems in the late 19th century, early 20th century in the U.S., like the cities, like the town, all that kind of stuff, all dominated by Irish immigrants, and yet they were poor, right? The rest of them, living down in the slums and everything, were extremely poor.
Yeah, I read his comparison. This is like he did this when he was quite a young man, but I read his comparison of the Jews and the Irish in Chicago, where he looks at how he says this is a really nice natural experiment because you have these two groups. They both came to the Chicago area in large numbers at about the same point in history. Right. These big waves. And they came with very similar. Most of them did not come with any resources to speak of. They're very poor. And then he sort of goes in the pros and cons like categories as well. The Irish. One thing they had going for them is that at least they spoke the language of the majority well. And a lot of the Jews who came did not speak English; they had to learn English. So he's like, okay, so at one point Irish, and then he goes through different things. But he says how within a generation, the Jewish immigrants were doing much better than the Irish immigrants, and then within 2 generations, it was just night and day. Yeah. And he talks about why is this? And so, what did the Irish community tend to put what did they invest in, and what did they
politics?
Well, politics, getting into into law enforcement, into politics, into union jobs, into various things like that. And then, meanwhile, the Jews in general tended to go more into entrepreneurial ventures, into trades to some extent, and into education, all of which ended up paying off and being a better kind of.
Did he also mention the different customs and habits? Because He
talks about how
to drink more and that kind of thing, which is interesting.
Oh, he talks about, and he even talks about the drinking thing, how even that is culturally dependent. So he says the Italian immigrants, on average, in terms of their yearly consumption of alcohol, drank just as much as the Irish immigrants. But they had practically none of the social dysfunction of the Irish. And this is because, he says, the Italians were drinking primarily, like a vast majority of them were drinking at the table with the family in a meal. And meanwhile, the Irish the guys were going out to the bar by themselves, drinking all their pay, going to whorehouses, getting into fights. So you have in one instance, you have alcohol being used as a social lubricant to bring a family closer together. So they're laughing and joking and having fun and bonding more, right? In another one, you're using alcohol. Alcohol causes massive social dysfunction. It's exactly the same substance, right? But but the way it's used, I think I definitely like his I guess you would call it almost like cultural geography. It's a very sort of, he tries to see how do certain cultural practices persist and evolve over time and predict outcomes, and determine outcomes.
Yeah, just a quick question there, John. What do you think about his theory about Southern, or at least American Black culture being a kind of his basic theory is that these immigrants came to the U.S. South from the border regions of Scotland and England that were very violent and dangerous before the United Kingdom went through its transformations from Scotland, right? And they went to the U.S. South. They had these habits of religious observance where eyes would roll back in their head and they would get into fights and they were all this stuff. And that somehow transmogrified to the slave community there. This is his theory, and that those maintained within the Black community in the South and in the North, because the Black migrants to the northern United States, like big cities like Detroit, they tended to be segregated through, from racism, right? They'd end up in their own communities. They wouldn't integrate into the population the way the Southern whites would in places like Detroit or New York. So he believes that these things that we associate with Black English and so on actually come from, from the Scottish, whatever, these people a long time ago. You've read that book, right, John?
Yes, yeah. That was the first one I read of his, actually, because I thought it was such a provocative thesis. The first time I heard of it, I was like, "What the fuck?" I think it's an interesting argument. I tend to be. I don't really know if it's true. I feel there's a whole bunch of information that I think I would need to. I would need to have and to learn to be able to evaluate whether that's true or not. I tend to think that it's much more a function of nature rather than culture. And what I mean by that is, I think we have got to the top of the food chain. We've been extremely successful as a species because we're very good at cooperation. We're incredibly good at cooperation. And that's, this is one of the things I try and tell my students is, I know you keep hearing that the central characteristic of business and economics is ruthless competition and all this stuff. But actually, the central feature from an ethological standpoint, if you're just looking at humans as animals, the central, most glaring thing that jumps out at you when you look at the world of business is incredible degree of cooperation. Like, so much cooperation, so much honesty, so much trust, so much morality, so much people doing the right thing even when they can get away with doing the wrong thing. Like that, and that characterizes even the black market trades in arms or drugs. Like if people actually, the expression "honor among thieves," like if there was not honor among thieves, thievery wouldn't work. Like crime. Like they talk about organized crime. Crime only works because it's organized.
Yeah.
Like disorganized crime doesn't work. Like not for very long. I mean, you have to be able to trust people
it gets back to this idea that, effectively you can think of humans when they interact with each other when they're strangers. Like let's say two groups of people live close to each other, right? Like two tribes or nations or whatever. There's two ways they can interact, really. That they can fight with each other, and then one can try and dominate the other and take all his stuff or their stuff or whatever, right? Or they can exchange peacefully. Right? They can go and trade things with each other. Maybe one group makes better at making spears. The other group is better at cutting. Maybe they live closer to the water or something, so they can get fish and they can sell them fish for the spears or something, right? And you see this dynamic all through history, right? And so I think in the Sowellian and the Steven Pinker and different, people like this, what they really are saying is that these two elements exist in our nature, and we want to try and, encourage the peaceful exchange element. Right, exactly what you're talking about, right? The cooperation element, as opposed to the dominance and fighting element, and we can't get rid of, the fighting, that the way of fighting. That's part of our nature as well. And there's always going to be some criminality is people doing that, right? Like people just stealing from other people, taking their stuff. You can't get rid of it completely. You can drop it down, but you can't get it down to zero, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think, and that's why I think I tend to see it as being much better to think about it as a function of nature than culture. So I think,
right.
Depending upon, to give you sort of an analogy to one of our relatives, there's these monkeys in Southeast Asia, and you find them. I've seen them in the wild. They're really cool looking, but you see them in Malaysia and Indonesia and on islands, and you can see them in Singapore even. But I'm blanking on the name of they're like golden something, but they're really, really cool. But apparently these monkeys, they have a flexible social organization, and it depends on sort of outside pressures. So there's this giant eagle that eats monkeys. It's like one of the, I think it's like, if it's not the biggest eagle in the world, it's one of the biggest eagles. Like the thing is fucking huge. Like it like stands like 3 feet tall. Wow. It's got a massive, they eat monkeys. So on islands that are in Malaysia and Indonesia and the Philippines and Papua New Guinea, where these monkeys are found, on islands that are completely covered in forest, so that it's like the forest is thick. So it's really hard for the eagles to like get in and get the monkeys, right? On those islands, the monkeys tend to live in pretty small groups. There's quite a bit of conflict within groups and quite a bit of conflict between groups, right? There's like, you see them fighting a lot and like fighting over territory and doing stuff like that. And then there's some islands where there's the forest cover is more sparse and there's lots of spaces between the trees. And so the eagles can get at the monkeys pretty easily in those places. Well, on those islands, the monkeys tend to live in much larger troops. So whereas on the heavily forested islands, they might live in groups of 20 or 30. In the islands where there's more predation threat, they'll live in groups of 150 to 200. And they'll have lots of monkeys who are on guard duty all the time. And then also their organization is very different. So on those islands, there are alpha males and alpha females within the group that heavily police conflict within the group. Right. So if two monkeys start fighting, they immediately are on them, kicking the shit out of them, like, quit your shit, before it like kind of
before the eagle comes in and kills both of you, kind of thing.
Well, because they seem to sort of recognize there's like an emergent order where they recognize that in order to survive, we have to have much higher degrees of cohesion and cooperation. And what's interesting is that these social structures are so flexible that if you have, there's been on islands where they've done heavy deforestation, for the logging of islands. So they've taken an island that was heavily covered and suddenly gotten rid of like 50% of the trees. So it's more. So now the monkeys are, and what you see is the small groups coalesce into bigger groups, and they change their organization. And the same thing for islands where the forest grows back and it becomes heavily. Well, you get like separatist movements within them, right. And they go off and form like smaller groups, and you have much more conflict.
Just can I ask something quickly there? They that happens fast enough that they don't get killed. Like the deforestation gets done, and then all of a sudden the monkeys start getting killed. So they actually start banding together quickly.
Yeah. It's quite flexible, and I think humans do the same thing. And so I think if you look at what happens in prisons, there's an emergent order that comes in prisons or in like subcultures where whenever you have the absence of a leviathan, when you have the absence of some sort of central power that keeps the peace and that imposes, when you have that, well, then suddenly people need to become much more tribal, and they need to become much more kind of wired and on edge. And they become much more sensitive to insults, and they have to respond. Probably the saddest example of this I've seen. Did you see on Netflix they had that movie, The Central Park Five?
Is that the one about those guys in New York that Donald Trump? I think he said they should die or something.
Yes, yeah. They were. Basically, the Central Park Five was there was this white woman who was a jogger, and she was like really violently raped and beaten and left for dead. He was in a coma for like months, and these five kind of black and Latino, I think it was one of them was Latino, teenagers were picked up on incredibly flimsy evidence and were railroaded and put into prison. And even though lots of evidence was coming out that showed that it was not them, they just kept railroading them. So they went to jail for a really long time. Eventually, they were the guy.
When They See Us, I think, is the Netflix dramatization. I think it's called When They See Us, I believe.
Is that what it is? Okay, well then
yeah. I think you posted about it.
I'm switching together two. Yeah. So you're totally right. Yeah, When They See Us. I just looked it up. Yeah. So in When They See Us, there's this one scene where this kid he was put in jail when he was a teenager. He was like 17. He was repeatedly raped, beaten to an inch of his life in prison. He finally gets out. He's exonerated. But you see, and I was actually thinking of Sowell's thesis when I watched this Netflix movie or series, is you see that he's trying to reintegrate into regular life, but because he's been socialized in prison to be so touchy about honor and shame, and so touchy about like somebody just in any way kind of insulting him or dissing him, that he needs to respond with this incredible overreaction, right? But of course, that kind of way of being, it makes sense in a dangerous environment, but in a civilized environment, this is incredibly bad. It's actually going to turn people off. It's going to make people you're going to get fired from jobs. People aren't going to want to be in a relationship with you. They're not going to want to live with you. So I think I don't think you need recourse to the Scots-Irish touchy shepherds in the Scottish Highlands. I don't think you need reference to that. I think all you need is to look at what happens to humans in different environments. So if you put a bunch of people, I saw this in Baltimore, right? When I was living there, in poor Black neighborhoods, predominantly Black ghettos in Baltimore, the police basically don't show up. Yeah. You can call the police. You can call, I could call the police if you're in the wrong neighborhood in Baltimore. If you call the police and say, there's somebody breaking into my house right now. He says he's going to rob me and rape me, and he's got a gun. They're not going to be there in 2 minutes. Yeah. They're not going to be there in 5 minutes. You're lucky if they'll be there in an hour, 2 hours. And they're only going to go into those neighborhoods if they can come in as an invading army with a helicopter, with lights, with armored personnel vehicles. They go in like an invading army. They won't go in without backup, put it that way. Right. So if you have a situation where basically it's similarly in a maximum security prison, usually the ratio of guards to inmates is 1 to 200. So there's no way that they can be watching what's happening all the time. There's literally just not enough of them. Right? And the idea that somehow the video cameras are going to capture that stuff, you have to have somebody looking at the video cameras, and there's not enough people to look at it. And there's lots of ways to get around that. Also, a lot of them are violent, disagreeable people anyway. Not all of them. I mean, some of them are just kids like that kid who got sent there, but you sort of have this mixture of the lack of Leviathan with just enough people who are predatory in the same place, right? Yes. Right. Yeah, but my point being is I think if you take a bunch of humans and you put them in an environment where there is law and order and there's stability and peace, well, then most humans will respond in a certain way to that environment. And if you put them into an environment where there is no safety and security and peace, well, they'll respond. And then, of course, there's people who have been extremely socialized to living in a peaceful society, who, like many progressives and libertarians, have illusions about what it would be like to, if you were to put them in like a dangerous neighborhood in Baltimore, they would just get their asses. They'd get in trouble so fast because they're so stupid and naive, and they would take dumb choices and they wouldn't be street smart, right? But then the flip side is if you have people who are who've been totally social. Like I remember this one friend of my sister's, he was really into the whole punk scene, the squeegee punk scene. And we ran into him once on the bus going back to Verdun, and like it was late. It was on like one of those night buses. Like we were coming back from the bars and everything. And he was saying he was already into heroin at that point, and he was starting to smell like a homeless person. And so my sister said to him, like, so, how much longer are you going to do this? Because his pretense, this was bullshit, of course. His pretense was that he was doing sort of research to write a book on homeless life, and he wanted to write a novel. And it's bullshit. He's just an addict, but whatever. But he said this is a story he told his family and everything. Mm-hmm. And I remember him saying, really made a big impression on me. He said, well, I'm going to stay for just a little bit longer, but I don't want to stay so long that I turn into an asshole. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, if you're in that environment for too long, you just don't know how to switch out of that gear. So you're always thinking about people stealing your wallet or stealing your bag or stealing your stuff, or you just have to be on edge all the time. And you're always sort of thinking about, what are all the bad things that could happen in this situation? How can I anticipate them? And that, at a certain point, if you're thinking like that all the time, it undermines your relationships with normal civilized people.
Well, it also uses up all your bandwidth, right? I mean, you can't divert any of your energy to trying to figure out how to make it. Also, you lose sight of the accumulative benefits of, spending 10% of your day doing X, and over, a 2 years time or whatever, you're going to get a benefit from that. You don't have any time to do that. You don't understand how that can ever work, because you're constantly just, living for the moment to keep yourself from dying, right? Something like that, right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. It takes up a lot of a lot of time. But I find I like, our last guest that we had on, Joseph Henrich, his book, the weirdest people in the world, and he argues that you can't really have capitalism and democracy and things like that. You can't; those things are not going to work unless you first have a particular kind of psychology, right? And you have to first kind of break down people's tribalism and people's connection to their kin, and you have to break people down more into nuclear families and individuals, and then that's when they can actually, they can work in these systems more. Because if they're still in that hyper tribal mode, which identity politics seems to be reviving in a big way, that it causes all of these other systems to not work properly. Because rather than, one of the examples he gives is, he says, if you have people that are very, very tribal, well, they're going to give the contract, or they're going to give their business to somebody who's a member of their group, even if that person is charging more for a shittier product. Like, they'll give that person the business because they, keep it all in the family, so to speak, right? And so because they're doing that, they're rewarding businesses that are actually really should probably fail, and they're creating kind of inefficiencies and in the market. So markets don't work very well in places where people are very tribal. That's his sort of point, right?
There also seems to be, I mean, you mentioned capitalism, democracy, and markets and so on. These are all sort of independent from the other. Like, democracy is a separate thing that developed, it took longer to develop, right? Like, it's like, if you just, this book I was reading by Sowell today, he was talking about how in the United Kingdom, how they gradually managed to bring the constituent elements, that even Scotland itself was somewhat divided, right, between the Highlands and Lowlands, and they managed to bring it together and put the stability, exactly what you're talking about, right? So gradually suppress these tribal conflicts, and people could, ensure stability, and also changing the cultural elements would change over time as well because of all that. But democracy did not come, like the general franchise, until way later in the 19th century, right? Wonder, Amy Chua has mentioned this before, that when you democratize a place that has all these tribal elements without having, it's natural to vote in a sort of, tribalist way for, like, that's just, what else would you do, right? That's, and so you wonder, it's not clear that democracy is something, I mean, I'm obviously, I'm in favor of democracy. I think it's the worst system except for all the others and all that stuff, but it's not clear. Democracy also has a system of incentives that can be easily perverted, and they can be perverted over time. It's not clear how to solve that problem, right? Because now we see, you mentioned the identity politics thing, right? We're starting to see this type of tribalism enter into our political system to some extent.
Yeah.
It always existed there to some degree. I mean, you've seen you posting about this, there's always been some element of this in Canada. The Governor General, for example, switches back and forth between a Francophone and an Anglophone, stuff like that. So maybe things like that can be in place that can help it, help bring some sort of unity to some extent if you have to a certain degree, but when it takes over, you're talking about, what I'm hearing you say is when the tribalism takes over to the point where it's like, I'm in my group and we're going to do everything we can to get our people to have the contracts and control the state and do the whole system, right?
Yeah. And it
solve that problem,
No, there's not. I mean, I would just, to return to what you said just before, the link between democracy and capitalism and free markets and all that stuff. I like the way that Yuval Noah Harari sort of unifies those things. And he says, actually, what unites them is they're all they spoke off of what he calls liberal humanism. Right? So he says liberal humanism he looks at it as a religion. And he says that it's a religion that says that ultimate authority is to be found not in God or in some sacred text or in something like that, but the ultimate authority is to be found in the individual, in the individual's sort of preferences and will. And so, so many things like from our society, like democracy as we conceive of it is predicated, and Sowell talks about this, is predicated on the idea that people know in the aggregate, not all of them individually, but on average, people know what's good for them better than experts do. So people know what to spend their money on better than experts do. People know what to invest in better than other people do, than the government does, and so you should trust people. You give people the vote because you believe that the citizenry, on average, is reasonable and decent and smart, and they know what's good for them. And that's kind of the assumption. Right now, you have lots of people, whether it's what Thomas Sowell calls the anointed, who believe that basically the people are idiots, and that experts should decide what is good for people. That experts. Now, what I find, to a large extent, I agree with that, and I think he's definitely onto something. I just don't know how. Once again, I don't know how he squares that with his talk about economics, because when it comes to the subject of economics, he sounds exactly like one of the anointed. He's constantly talking about how the idiots don't understand economics, and like only people who are economically literate, which, when you scratch the surface, I'm friends with a number of economists of various left-wing, right-wing, centrist, libertarian, and people who have PhDs in economics, and almost without exception, they've told me that Thomas Sowell is a great thinker, but on economics, he has a pretty narrow view of economics, and so it's sort of like an evangelical Christian telling me, like, you need religion, right? They don't mean religion in general. They mean evangelical Protestant Christianity, right? They don't mean, and so when he says, like, people are economically illiterate, usually what he actually means by that is not agreeing with my view of economics, right? Which is not, like, his view of economics is not in any way the prevailing view, even among classical economists. Like, his view is seen as being quite University of Chicago, quite, fundamentalist.
I think in terms of his views on economics, economics has become much more scientific. This is my sort of outsider's understanding. It's become much more, sort of looking at algorithms, things like this, and mathematical models and things like that, and also creating experiments, right? So you create these sort of lab experiments and you run them. Thomas Sowell doesn't really do that. He seems, if you read Adam Smith, he seems to use Adam Smith's model as the way of orienting himself in it, much as he has a theory, like you say, his belief that the law of supply and demand is likely to prevail over, intervention, let's say, right? And then he takes a look at the world and he tries to see instances where that might be true or not true, and gather evidence from everything from novels to, Adam Smith did pretty much the same thing in The Wealth of Nations, because there was no economics, there were no papers to go and dig up, the experiments that people had run or whatever, right? There was, he was the first one to do it. So I think that Sowell's economics is a kind of older style of economics. I think that's my impression. I don't know. I'm very much a hobbyist of economics. It's not my field. I have a different set of, I study different things. My background is different from that. But like I said, I became an amateur at it after the financial crisis, and that's my view. He seems to have this almost like a holistic view of how to view things, and I don't know.
Yeah, well, I think my problem in general with the way that he deals with things like government intervention and with markets is that he tends to, and it's funny because I was talking to the other day to Jacob Levy about this, who is a political theorist at McGill, and he was really, he's a very, he's a libertarian, and he was a big fan of Thomas Sowell when he was younger, and Ayn Rand and all of that stuff. And he said, yeah, he goes, like, I still, like, I learned a great deal from him, but he said that the irony of Thomas Sowell is that he's this guy who is, he rails against people who oversimplify a great deal. And his critique of people oversimplifying things is excellent. But then he goes on to oversimplify like crazy. And it's like, dude, like, why did you, like, doctor, heal, like, physician, heal thyself? Like, so for instance, one thing that I found annoying in, especially in his book, The Quest for Cosmic Justice, where he sort of, whenever he's talking about how evil government intervention is, he always looks to let's say, like, China under Mao, or Soviet Union under Stalin, or, like, Mussolini. He looks to these, like, horrible, like, examples, which were horrible, no doubt. Like, and so all government intervention is a classic example of a slippery slope argument. All government intervention naturally leads to this horrific outcome. And then when he's talking about business and free markets, he tends to sort of rely on a very idealized view of business and of the economy, which, like I said in that sort of thread where we were discussing this, like, it seems like it applies perfectly well to adapt, right? To the economy of adapt, absolutely, like, and to small businesses and maybe even medium-sized businesses. But his analysis just doesn't make sense if you're trying to explain Amazon or Google or Facebook, these giant organizations that have the power to, manipulate. Like there are more lobbyists right now in Washington, D.C., representing Facebook than there are members in both houses of Congress combined. These are all people that are making a minimum of $185,000 a year to lobby on behalf of, like, that is, when you're wielding that, when you have that many smart, highly motivated people working towards a particular end, like, that's not they can distort the market in all sorts of, amazing ways. And that's not sort of what Adam Smith, that's not what Adam Smith had in mind.
Adam Smith hated big, huge businesses like that. If you read his books, he talked about the East India Company with the most, exactly on the terms that you're talking about, how they had distorted British government policy and everything. There's an economist called Mike Munger who talks about, this gets back to what I was saying before about how institutions, as they get bigger, he talks about how any business, as it gets bigger, it's when it makes more investments as it gets bigger, initially it sort of, diversifies, opens up other sectors and spends money on research and development and everything. Then it reaches a point where every dollar it spends will get a better return from trying to influence government. It does get back to government control, right? They start investing. This is what the social media companies are trying to do. They're trying to influence the state, so the state can use the awesome power of the monopoly on violence, let's say, right? That's the definition of a state, right? So they're trying to, most of what little I understand about the big social media companies is they seem to want some form of regulation. And this is one of these things that's kind of like a flare, right? When you see a company that is in an industry and they want the government to regulate that industry, that's kind of like a red flag. Like, why would they want rules? Well, the reason is because they want to set the rules up in such a way so that they can exclude competitors from getting into the market, right? So I don't really see anything incompatible with Adam Smith was just, vicious against the Dutch East India Company. He was very complimentary about the Hudson Bay Company. There's a long section of his book. I don't know if you've read The Wealth of Nations.
I have.
Yeah. I don't know if you remember this part. There's a long section where he went through about how the books were really well kept and they were sort of careful. They never went to the government for loans or anything like that. Like they were, and part of the reason for that is that it was a relatively small company, a poor part of the world, right? The East India Company was this behemoth that was dealing with the sort of the riches of the world at that time, right?
Yeah.
And all that stuff from India that was this huge, sort of attracted the more venal elements that are going to try and so I don't really see. I understand your point about the the way that he switches back and forth from hating on the anointed to becoming kind of like an anointed. I think that's kind of how I heard it. I don't know if I don't want to caricature what you were saying, but I can totally get that, but I don't really see a contradiction in the laissez-faire, like in the sense that it still comes back to the idea that if you believe there has to be a state, what should that state do? And then if you're an entity and you can influence that state in your favor, if you're big enough to do that, maybe you're going to do that, right? And I don't think that's a good thing, but I don't think it contradicts the idea that the best way for things to play out over time is to let them be, right? For me, there are a few exceptions where the government has to be involved, right? One, because that's really the core question, right? Where should the government intervene in the economy and where should it let, you can make a case for a few social things, like maybe education to some extent, at least for the dispersion of money. There's a different question about how that money could be spent. In Sweden, they have vouchers and things like that. That's a good education system. Healthcare to some extent, some control to some extent, maybe. Definitely defense, right? National defense and internal security, I think, is generally better off when you have a Leviathan. And then there's a few strange exceptions, like the distribution of electrical power, right? I've been thinking for years and years with my classical liberal brain, trying to come up with a way that, Hydro-Quebec could function better if it were a bunch of different companies, and I just can't figure out how it would work. Because everything I've seen in other cases where they've tried to do that has usually ended up in a, kind of a disastrous. You have a kind of problem there with the, distribution of things. Anyway, but apart from that, I don't, when it comes to could bring it back to the Facebook and Amazon and all those things. If you just wait long enough, if you have a dynamic system, right, those, it's likely that if we don't do anything with Facebook and Twitter and all these companies, that in 20 or 30 years' time, there's going to be some other big thing. Do you remember when Microsoft was going to take over the world in the 1990s? It was this enormous thing. In Europe, they regulated it. This is, they're embedding it on the computers, and people, they're not being given a real choice. And that was all true, right, for the time. Mm-hmm. Except that if you just allow the dynamism to continue functioning, someone's going to come up with something else that's going to make whatever that is not as important anyway in enough time. It's almost always the case, right? If you don't intervene too much, right? If you intervene to a certain extent, you get in there, start monkeying around, you can get it to seize, and you can say, okay, this is our system now, and you get stuck with that, what that system is. A good example of this, from what little I understand about it, was the regulation of airwaves that really slowed down innovation in the 20th century. Anyway,
well, I think very often what happens, and if you look at Microsoft is a good example of this, but there's many examples like this. If you look at the history of a lot of these very, very successful organizations, and that are presented as examples of why the free market is so amazing, you'll usually find that the initial technology was produced with government money. That it was taxpayers' money that came up with the technology and invested huge amounts of money in the technology and created, and then somebody sort of found a way to make money off of it and went off and made money with it. I have no problem with that. I think, more power to you. But then to turn around, it seems really, really ungrateful and shitty to turn around and act as if, oh, I'm a self-made man. I just sort of came up with this off the top of my head. No, you fucking didn't. You basically stole some technology from the big corporation you were working for. You were working for IBM, and you stole some of their tech, and you made a lot of money off of it. Or you took stuff that was produced by public money, and then it's the public that has, we have created this huge infrastructure and the roads and all the things that make it possible for you to produce your goods and services and get them to market. And now you're going to act like somehow it reminds me very much of a certain kind of guy, and I was totally this guy. The certain kind of guy who was into Nietzsche and Ayn Rand as a teenager. And it's this sort of, usually a guy, not always, who's just yeah, don't tell me what to do, Mom. He's I want to do it. And this attitude of, I'm like a mushroom. I just emerged overnight as a fully grown adult, and I've completely made my life, and I deserve everything I have, and not recognizing that people for years, usually women, wiped your ass, fed you, taught you how to read. You went to school. You got so much help and so much love from so many people. And to just turn, and eventually you'll be old and fucked up, and you'll have to get your diapers changed again, and people will be waiting on you until you die. And so at the peak of your strength, when so many things have come together to make the civilization that you live in, to create the institutions, to sort of act as if you are just apart from all of these things. And I don't need any of these things, and I don't fucking owe you anything. This is all mine. It just seems to be in poor taste.
Well, I totally agree. One of the best examples I've heard of that is when you take a totally meritocratic structure like basketball, let's say, right? So you have some guy who worked his way up out of a poor neighborhood, and he's this amazing basketball player. It's like the fact of him having that opportunity, the fact that he was lucky enough to be born in a time and in a place where he could exercise that skill and be paid for that is just astoundingly lucky, right? And then, then you go into a bunch of other things. He was lucky to be tall, and he was lucky to have the right type of environment where he could go and practice all the time or something, and all these different things. Any person who's who's successful in life has had all of what you're talking about. There's no question about that, right? But they also have to do, the 10,000 hours, right? The famous, right? And it's interesting how I think that a lot of just facing life is, for young people, is hard to just go out and start doing things because you're afraid of failing, right? I myself as a younger person, right? It was just hard for me to just go out. What am I going to do? I did what I was going to do, and you're sort of paralyzed by fear, right? So if you're kind of told, oh no, that guy who made all that money, he's no better than you, and it's kind of like that's really going to help that much, right? It's kind of like you want people to say, I'm not as good as I can be, right? So maybe if I work really hard, maybe if I try and be like, Steve Jobs, or I don't know, James Brown, or who knows who, right? If I try and be like that, maybe I will, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if that, it's more like, I think the problem there about the self-made man, I totally understand that the person was also made by society, but they weren't entirely made by society too. They are exceptional in some way, right? Any person who is successful in life has something exceptional about them, right?
I don't know. It's just, I like what Thomas Sowell says, where he talks about this, where he says that, if you grow up in an incredibly kind of messed up environment where you're surrounded by lots of dysfunction and you're neglected and you're abused, maybe you have like lead in your water, and so you've reduced your IQ and stuff like that. For somebody like that, for them just to grow up to being like a decent person who's not a criminal, who is an amazing achievement. Like that person is very exceptional, but anybody who doesn't know the specifics of their case wouldn't realize what a miracle that person is, and then meanwhile, somebody who like grows up with privilege, every advantage in the book, and they do really, really well. If they end up like being, I don't know, an English prof at McGill, maybe that's like, actually kind of underwhelming considering like all the advantages. But no, when I'm talking about the sort of the Nietzsche, Randian, rugged, I'm talking about like, I've met a fair number of people in my life. I've got one guy in particular I'm thinking of who, like, he inherited in his mid-20s, like a lot of money. Like we're talking like over $20 million, right? And he is like one of the most hardcore devotees of Nietzsche and Rand and stuff like that. And the guy's never worked a day in his life, like at all. He's never, and yet he's always lecturing and posting stuff about how, lazy people need to get a job and stop looking for handouts and stop looking at, dude, like, I feel like, Dave Chappelle, like, slow your roll, man. Like seriously, like you haven't got to where you are by hard work. Like your father worked really hard and made a lot of money and left it to his kids, but
I mean, the way people end up, who was it? Coleman Hughes was saying, I was listening to an interview with him the other day. He was talking about how James Baldwin and Thomas Sowell grew up in the same neighborhood, same time. I guess James Baldwin is another one of these, these lucky few. And they went, I think they may have gone to the same school, right? I'm not sure.
Wow.
I'm not sure. I bet someone could fact check me on that. But anyway, at the same time, and look at their politics were, just like night and day, right? They ended up with, and they had they're both African Americans and, from the same similar background, time and place and whatnot. And look at the divergence there. So just the way that people end up with if someone ends up with a Randian, I tend to be, I don't know about Ayn Rand. I haven't read any of her books. My brother says, "Oh yeah, you have to read Ayn Rand. She's great. Her books." But I tend to be in the more sort of classical liberal leaning libertarian bent, right? Someone else who I grew up with, other people, they have different views. People I'm very close with have very different political outlooks and so on than I do. And I mean, I don't know. I mean, I don't. If people have that view and maybe it's undeserved, if that person I don't know who you're talking about, but I mean, if that, I don't really see how that negates the main point about what, the laissez-faire view, if you believe in it, right? I'm not sure if that makes sense. I'm not seeing that connection exactly.
Well, the connection for me is that I'm, once again, is my central issue with Sowell is that I love what he says about the tragic vision. I feel like, I was very much affected in my 20s by reading St. Augustine and his vision. He's kind of I would say probably the most profound exponent of the tragic vision that Sowell is talking about is in St. Augustine. You can find it in the City of God and in other writings of his, but he basically says that he has a religious explanation for it, but you don't need his religious explanation in order to find his worldview insightful. So he says that there are basic flaws in human nature that cannot be remedied ever. We can just sort of it's the difference between problems and conditions, right? If you have a condition, you just try and manage the symptoms. There's no solution for the condition. Like if you have an uncurable disease, then we don't try and get rid of it totally because we can't. So we just manage the symptoms, right? So, and problems have solutions, right? So you try and that's very central to Augustine and to Sowell that a lot of what the anointed refer to as social problems are actually social conditions. Yeah, they're not problems. They don't have, there's no permanent, at the moment, there's no permanent solution to the problem of scarcity. There's always more demand than supply. There's always more things that we want to do with our time than time we have. There's always more, and so on and so forth. So because of those limitations on existence we have to sort of work with these limitations as best we can. So I like all of that. I just find that tragic vision does not, to my mind, doesn't mesh nicely with the vision of people sort of making decisions and being totally free and being responsible for it. And so I for me, like that, the guy who's really into kind of freedom and liberty and individualism and everybody gets what they deserve, who inherited, $20 million in his mid-20s, like it doesn't seem to me that he is adequately recognizing how much he's benefited. Now, I'm not into I'm not saying people have to be guilty. I'm not saying they have to give their money up to the poor or anything like that. Those are different questions. But I do think my mom used to say all the time when we were kids, and I repeat this, repeat it to my own kids like a mantra, to whom much is given, much is required. So if there's a little old lady who's like,
sounds vaguely similar to the Marxist a little bit. I don't, the to each according to his ability. Is that the?
It's similar. I mean, they perverted it horribly.
Yeah.
I'm talking about it more in the kind of Judeo-Christian sense, where it's just if you've been given a lot of strength, or you have a lot of strength at this point in your life, well, use that strength to do good. To do good stuff, like to defend people that are being fucked over by stronger people who can't defend themselves, than to help old ladies across the street. Because when you're a little baby, you can't help people like that. And when you're a little old guy yourself, you can't help people like that. So if you have a lot of resources, whether it be physical health, mental health, money, smarts, like use your stuff to, as much as possible, use that to like help other people and to give back.
Right. Well, many people do, right? It's important to remember that charity is very common. I mean, and you can also, another thing, I think Sowell talks about this, about how the introduction of where the state takes care of, is that you see a reduction in people helping out for the obvious reason that, if you're a wealthy person in a society that has a functional welfare state, well, the government's taking care of it. They're taxing me anyway. So, I think that you can divide. I wanted to come back to your point there about the to each according to his. I forget how your mother phrased it. It was much more elegant, I think. But in any case, it's kind of like you can divide that behavior between just small group behaviors. So if you're with your friends and your family and you're doing everything you can in your job, let's say, right, you can actually do a lot in that way, right? But when you get into a group scale of the world, or even not even the world, but just the entire city of Montreal or something like that, the province of Quebec, let's say, or something. How much can I actually do to help the people who have X problem, right? I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to do that without making their lives worse because I don't know enough about them, right? I don't know if that makes any sense. You can divide, and is it a good idea to force me to give up my money to go and help those people? Maybe that's the statist idea, right? That we will tax you, we'll take your money away, and then we'll create, a system, where people with drug problems go or something, have like a, treatment program or something to help people with addiction or something like that, right? That makes some sort of sense, except that then you get into the incentives problem again. You disincentivize individuals from doing that when you socialize it to the state. This is well documented. Charity has gone way down as a proportion since the 19th century.
I totally recognize that there's trade-offs and they're not all pleasant. But if you look at,
it could be.
If you look at, like, for instance, when I was at Hopkins in Baltimore, I remember my wife, who I met on Alyssa there, and she was studying with this guy. I'm blanking on his name right now, but he's a famous social scientist, and he had actually studied specifically orphanages and how they dealt with orphans and stuff like that. And he looked at how it was dealt with by charities, by like the Catholic Church and by various kinds of charities. And he looked at that in the 18th century and the 19th century. And then he looked at what happened when kind of the state took over that stuff. And he kind of does a cost-benefit analysis, and he looks at how much people gave to charity and how much people to try and then he looks at, what were the life chances of how likely were the kids to be abused, neglected, how likely were they to live to be 5 years old, 10 years old, 15 years old. And he basically shows that, like, he does a comparison of 6 different countries and how the switch from charity to welfare, to the state doing it. And he says in every instance, on every single indicator, the results were way, way better when the state took over doing that. However, what they created was human, and so it still sucked in various ways. And it kind of sucks to be an orphan, no matter who's, but he says in every possible way, it was a huge step up to have this taken care of by the state rather than, and it also, but the other thing he says is it actually was cheaper too. It ended up being cheaper. So in the same way that, like, you look at the American healthcare system, they spend a massive amount of money on healthcare and they don't get it's the number one reason people declare bankruptcy right now is medical bills, right? That they pay a huge amount of money. And I remember when we lived down there, it was unbelievable. Like, your taxes are less, but the amount of money that you spend on your insurance every month, it's like every paycheck. And then when something actually goes wrong, like the premiums are huge. Like it's the idea that somehow the free market or charity can do it better. No.
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, the one thing I would say about that is that very often these things are impossible to prove one way or another. You can show that the things got better. I'm sure those are true. You can also show that charity giving went down. You can also show as a percentage of income. How could you? I'm not sure how you could disentangle the general economic growth, right, from that as well, right? Because it's kind of like, I mean, Thomas. Just to bring it back to Thomas Sowell, right? He talks about how the general view of African Americans is that sort of the emancipation, let's say, from started with the Voting Rights Act in 1965 and the Great Society. But he documents how the social rise of blacks from in the 20th century, just like in income and literacy and all these other factors, was sort of rocketing upward for the first half of the 20th century, right? And then it actually slows down with those other things. It actually levels off, and it's still rising, but see, what I'm trying to say there is, how do we know when we say we got better results when we took over from religious institutions? How do we know that those better results weren't just part of trends that were moving forward anyway, just because the society was richer and richer and richer over time? How do we know? I don't know. I imagine it's more efficient to have sort of one system like that than to have, a whole bunch of churches all. It's also better to have one system than to have it be segregated by your ethnicity. So if you're Jewish, you go to a Jewish hospital, and if you're, that's how it used to be, right? The charities used to be based on, your religious affiliation, right? So the Protestants and Jews had better hospitals, and the Catholics had worse ones, right? That was, so you have that problem, right? But I just don't know. And that's very interesting about Annalisa's teacher, I guess it was. I just don't know how much of that could be disentangled from general rise anyway, economically, right? When you see those, people have been better off for the last several hundred years all over the place, right? And so you get this problem. People say, well, then the government took over and things got better. It's like, yeah, well, that's true, except how do we know what would have happened if we had just sort of allowed it to organize itself in a different way or something? I don't know. It's very hard to know. We can't turn around and run those. But what we can do is there are natural experiments of government intervention versus non-government intervention, right? So like less or more of those institutions, and we can see differences there. I used to live in South Korea. I don't know if you know this about me, but I lived there for a couple of years, and I lived within walking distance of the DMZ, right? So I used to be able to hike up the hill behind my house. I remember standing up there and looking at the South Korean side, and there were all these sort of rice paddies, and the hills were all covered in trees. They were trees. And then you look across the other side, and there was just completely barren, right? So there you have probably the closest thing to a natural experiment. So on the northern side, the people were so desperately poor because of over-intervention, let's say, right? That's sort of an extreme case of along with other problems, that they get cold in the winter. So what do? They go and they chop down the trees. They can't trade effectively with the rest of the world because of the choice of the political system. So they can't import. They don't have enough money to import, things like petroleum and stuff to run in their stoves, right? I don't know. I'd be curious to learn more about that. Those studies and those things, because I'm not sure. I mean, because they're really, I'm not necessarily saying that the government should not be involved in those things and that we should just take the government away from orphanages and allow, I don't know what a solution is for, you could call that a condition, right? Something like an orphanage is sort of like a societal condition. You're probably never going to get rid of some kids who are going to end up needing some care from the whole village, let's say, right? You probably, always going to be some.
I can't think of any natural, off the top of my head. I can't think of any natural experiments which would be able to prove what the case I was just making. I can think of natural experiments that prove definitively that things like all sorts of manufactured goods and agriculture do way better when government stays out of it for the most part. I mean, there's so many examples of that. I mean, the one that jumps to mind immediately is you look at Zimbabwe, and like that had this like incredibly flourishing agricultural sector where they were just making tons of money. They had plenty of food to feed themselves and to feed, half of Africa, and like export tons of stuff. And then as soon as the government takes over and says, "Oh, we're going to bring social justice to the sector," and they, which of course, as it very often does, just means putting my cronies in power, right? So, and they put all these people that didn't know anything about farming and didn't know anything about the international.
Even if they weren't their friends, if they just, let's say they just randomly chose black Zimbabweans and said, this farm owned by white people, the chances are that guy doesn't know how to do what the white farmer knows how to do, right? It's just learn how to do. This is the other thing about these middlemen minorities. This is a problem all over the world. There's this idea that if you're running a business where, say, you're lending money or you're doing something like that, then you're not really doing anything. You're just extracting from all the sort of hardworking farmers and people in the factories with their hammers and doing, and all this stuff. I'm caricaturing it, of course, but it's stark misunderstanding that the people who are performing financial services, for example, are doing, they have an enormous amount of skill, and they know what they're doing, and they know how to assess risk and where to put the capital and how to, and with every case, those natural experiments are the most tragic, right? I mean, you're talking about, what was that one in Uganda too, where they went after the, I think it was
South Asians.
They went after the South Asians, and you just see a total collapse, right? You see, and this brings up one funny thing that Sowell mentions. He talks about the ethnic, not funny, humorous, but just interesting to get back to maybe a mistake of his, or at least a, ideological, is he talks about the ethnic cleansing of Germans from Eastern Europe, which is one of these things that not many people know about. But after World War II, there was, there have been minorities of Germans throughout Central and Eastern Europe for many centuries, right? From the Deutsch,
going back to the Middle Ages,
way back to the Middle Ages, right? And in some cases, they were relatively small in number, like in Russia. In other cases, I mean, in Czechoslovakia, they were 3 million, right? So the famous Beneš decrees cleansed the country of. In fact, the German minority is this is another country I happen to live in as well. It's interesting with Slovakia, but the German minority is the reason why the Czechs and Slovaks originally formed a political union. Was because I had a guy tell me once when I was in the Czech Republic how when they formed Czechoslovakia in 1919, they had, this sort of like, if they had made just the Czech Republic, they would have been like 50-50 German Czech, right? And so boy, this is going to be a really big problem politically because they run all the factories and they own all the capital and everything and all this stuff. So they created this union with Slovakia, who and then they sort of had it be sort of maybe a 30% minority. But in any case, just to get back to this example of Sowell, they did the ethnic cleansing after World War II. They had an excuse in all these societies to go after these Germans who were, socially higher up the ladder and so on. They threw them out. There's something like 12 million people moved. But Sowell, at one point, one of his books, he said that this was one of the reasons why the economy collapsed in Czechoslovakia, and it went, and all this stuff. He gave all these statistics about how the industrial output went down. He's giving all these numbers and statistics, which are all true. And then, he connects it to when the Germans were all thrown out, 3 million people. They went to, forced them to go to Germany, and many of them had never even been there and all this stuff. It's all true. But he neglects to mention something really important, was that at the same time, a socialist government was established at exactly the same time that the Beneš decrees come into effect, right? So I'm surprised that he wouldn't at least mention it as a footnote, because obviously that had a dampening effect on exchange as well, right? The government takeover of all the industries and but I guess you'd chalk that up to, I don't know if that's an ideological mistake. I don't know, or how much of it is true. Like, looked at that case, right? How much Czechoslovak economic total disaster from 1945 to 1975 was because of the socialism that was installed, and how much of it was the Germans leaving, because that must have been something, right? They left and they took as much of, they took all of their human capital with them. That is, in their brains, they, to take the Malcolm Gladwell thing, right? They had all those skills and everything, and they were left from the country. and maybe they stole all their factories and all that stuff, so they, couldn't leave with that. But how much of it was one, how much of it was the other? It's a good question.
It's hard to tell. I thought I would just finish our conversation with sort of just maybe if both of us could say, two of the things that we've learned from Thomas Sowell. Like I'll sort of start off. One of the things that I remember, I think this is probably the first thing that I read in Sowell where I was like, wow, I'm going to learn a lot from this guy. Is when he talked about, and there's many examples of this, but this is one that like jumps to mind, is when he talks about his critique of the concept of income distribution. And he says, like, there's these ways in which we talk about things which sort of stack the deck in favor of one conclusion, so that it seems like you're having like an open conversation about something, but you've stacked the deck in advance. And so he says, like, when we talk about income distribution, it sounds as if like all the money is put in a big pile, and then we decide like how to like share it out. And that if there's big amounts of inequality, that it's necessarily because we didn't share it out evenly or equitably, that we have to. And he says, like, this is just not how it actually happens. Most of the money that people have was put in their pocket voluntarily because they were giving somebody something, like a service or a good that person wanted, and so they voluntarily took their wallet out and handed them some money or a card, and like it wasn't. So the idea that somehow, okay, well, we need to have some, government organization that steps in and kind of makes sure that we share out the stuff, more fairly, like that is not at all how it happens.
Yeah. And I think that's a great one. But one thing I would say is he's been saying for a very, very long time, going back to, I've read books and seen interviews with him from like 70s and 80s, that this strange idea that if you have, 23% of Canada's population is French Canadian, so therefore there must be 23% of carpenters and 23% of lawyers and 20, or something like that. In other words, if you just take the population of a given society and you cut it into different groups and they all must be equally represented, that idea, if you think about it, is very strange. And there's nowhere in the world where that has ever shaken out that way. It has never come out. He talks about how he went around the world looking at different countries and he never found a society where there was a different composition of ethnic groups and they all had equal representation in every single field, right? So you could get into a long discussion there too, like, is that just or unjust? And that's not really the point. It's more, why do they shake out differently? Why do some people in their homes and communities and families and so on get more interested in doing different things, right? Because we know that interest is the main driver of why people get better at things, right? What you like doing when you're 10 and 15 and so on years old, that you spend more time doing, that's what you tend to get better at, that you tend to excel at in your life generally, right? We want families and different peoples do that, right? We don't, right?
I agree that definitely, everywhere in the world today and in human history, there's been inequalities of outcome for sure, and people don't all end up. But I also think that the desire to try and make our ruling institutions to make them more sort of representative, I don't think that is something new. Like, we've talked about this with regard to like Canada and the history of Canada, how they always tried to sort of make sure that there was a good mix of francophones and anglophones in the cabinet in various kind of positions of power, because they recognized that, okay, if it's nothing but francophones in the federal government in high positions for 20 years, well, guess what? Pretty soon, the English Canada are going to be like, this is bullshit. Like, we're not being this is clearly a system that is rigged in favor of like the francophone elites. So we're out of here. Let's like separate, right? And all countries and even down to like families and religious have ways of trying to become to be more. So the example of like this guy going to a libertarian conference and they try and like put everybody who's like a woman and minority like up on the stage to make it look more. That is not new to this historical period. I mean, the Roman Empire, when it was expanding, they very self-consciously included, as they were expanding, they opened up citizenship to people who were not ethnically Italian, like from the Italian peninsula. They opened it up to people who were had tall, blonde, blue-eyed Germanic people. They opened it up to Gauls. They opened it up to East Asians, to people from North Africa. They specifically tried to put people from these outlying, newly conquered areas into positions of power, precisely because they, not because they were, kind of like proto woke people who were trying to celebrate our diversity. It's because they just understood that like you can't have legitimacy of a big, whether it's the Montreal Police or the Roman Empire or Canada or the United States, you can't have legitimacy if certain people are perceived as being
outsiders,
constantly like outside of power, like not invited in on the party.
But that's a power structure, though, right? That's not like, I mean, Sowell is talking about just all, like everything. So if you look at the number of, jazz saxophonists or something like this idea, like now with this woke thing, we've got this thing, for example, with orchestras and stuff, right? And things like that. And you think, I mean, it's like, I totally understand it from a political point of view for something like the police. That's something that makes a lot of sense to me to say, okay, if you have part of the city where you have higher crime and there's also an ethnic group that's more predominant in that part of the city, you want to have more police just to make the people in that community not to feel like they're in a war with another ethnic group, right? So it's not like, I lived in Park Extension for like 12 years, and I remember the police and they sort of felt like an outside occupying force. It would be some, French Canadian guy would come in, and nobody in the neighborhood was very few, But I just think that idea to apply to, say, I don't know, like lawyers, or you know what I mean? Like it's if you just sort of take that as an axiomatic thing for all professions and trades and stuff, and say that there should be this equal distribution or something, I don't know that is necessary, and it actually might harm the way that those trades are functioned, or how they work, if it's applied in areas other than politics and the police. You could probably name a few, but I don't know what you think.
No, I totally agree with that. Like when it, there's certain things like obviously law enforcement and politics where, those are two obvious examples where having, being perceived as being more kind of diverse and kind of representative of the population is not just good from some sort of celebrate diversity abstract sense. It's good just in terms of it makes it easier for you to do your job. Like you have legitimacy. But yeah, when it comes to like, I don't know, brain surgery or, making like spaceships that are going to go to Mars, like I want like the best people in those jobs. And I don't care if a meritocratic system shakes out so that all the brain surgeons in Quebec end up being, I don't know, Korean women. I don't care. Like if they're the best like brain surgeons, that's who I want operating on my brain. I don't want like somebody that, some white Irish guy that they hired for diversity. Like I don't want that guy. Yeah, okay, you can have that guy for your brain surgery. I want the Korean chick who does it well. Like so.
So where's the border there? That's a difficult problem. Is where is it okay to do something for a political reason, like a good reason to try and bring a group or some set of people into your holiday, and where is it something where it's actually going to harm the quality of the service or even harm the diversity of your system. If you're doing it to the point where you're alienating, it becomes a thing where people are forced into thinking of themselves in these ethnic groups and how they have grievances one against the other. That's a very common Sowell point as well. That might be my second point. Would be Sowell talks about how, like, if they're told that they should be, that they're part of an ethnic group and they should focus on that, and that group has been oppressed or whatever, right? Often it's true. I mean, it's that doesn't ever help those people advance in any way, right? Any group of people, right? Very rarely. To think of yourself as a victim is probably the worst thing you can do. A good example is if you had a child that was handicapped, right? If you know people who have handicapped children, the one thing they try and do is to instill the idea in that kid that they can do what they want to do. They can overcome this thing. The worst thing you could do is to encourage them to feel sorry for themselves. And they would have a good reason to feel sorry for themselves, right? I mean, you can't walk or whatever, right? But that's not going to help them. I don't mean to compare handicapped people with, racial minorities or something like that, but you can think of it in those terms, right? That we should do everything we can to send the message to people that they can do better than whatever they're doing now, right? Regardless of where they come from. I think that's a good idea, but I don't know, maybe not.
Well, that's a nice, hopeful place to finish on. Anyway, this has been absolutely fascinating. I think we may have to do like a part 2, because there's just so much more. Like, we're already like 2.5 hours in, and I have a list of so many other things that I wanted. Because Thomas Sowell is just such a rich, interesting source. He's fantastic stuff.
I'd like to just quickly thank you too, because this has been I've really appreciated the conversation. The opportunity to talk about Sowell as well is interesting. I use him a lot in my classes as well. I don't know some of his work, and I agree. I've got a whole list of things I didn't even get to here that we could cover at another time. So
yeah, I mean, I guess the short version, I would say, in answer to your question about where is the border, I'm not exactly. There's some extreme cases like law enforcement and politics on one side, and then brain surgery and spaceship engineering on the other, maybe. But but in terms of where the border is, I'm not sure. Like, I used to think, for instance, that education was, especially higher education, was totally on the brain surgery side, that you just want the best people and it doesn't really matter. But I've, been reading some reports. I mean, I'll tell you about this when we're off air. I'm not going to say this loud, but let's just say I've seen information recently that has been quite disturbing on that score. That in many humanities departments, the chances that a boy will fail class is 3 times more likely if his teacher is a woman, as a teacher is a man. And I've read a lot of credible accounts that if your teacher, if you're a member of a minority group and your teacher is a member of the same minority group, you are significantly more likely to do well in that class and to be engaged and to learn more, and even down to dialect. So if you speak a particular dialect or you have a particular accent, so I don't know, let's say you're like a New Yorker, you got like a thick New York accent. Kids in your class who are native-born New Yorkers will, on average, do better in a class where the person not only,
Thank you for listening to today's guest on the Mega Blast podcast. I've been your host, Jason McDonald. This podcast is brought to you by Arts and Opinion, an online journal, which is also available in the Permanent Archives of Canada. Visit us online at artsandopinion.com.